welcome back to the Prioritising Patient Safety session, and really pleased to have a really brilliant lineup of speakers today. We've got Dr. David Mayer, who is the CEO of the Patient Safety Movement Foundation, Tracy Granczyk, who's the founding director of the Centre for Narratives at MedStar, Helen Haskell, who leads patient safety across organisations as the co-chair of the Patient Safety Advisory Group at the WHO, as well as other organisations that she's also been instrumental in founding and developing. We have Dr. Raj Ratwani, who's one of the directors from MedStar Health, and Professor Peter Brennan from the UK, who is a consultant oral and maxillofacial surgeon and has published lots of work around human factors and patient safety, and also happens to be the editor of Gray's Surgical Anatomy. So really pleased to welcome you all today, and thank you so much again to Patient Safety Movement Foundation for supporting this session. I know that some of you have already interacted with them in the virtual expo. Please do say hi. Find out more about their amazing organisation and what they can do to support you as students, clinicians, patients and leaders looking to improve healthcare. So, without further ado, let's begin the session. It's great to see Tracy and Helen and David after 5 years. I last saw them in Napa in California for the Patient Safety Roundtable. Shall we begin with David? And I'll stay here in the background, and if David David will be chairing the session today.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. It's great to be with you and great to be with everyone here. It's really an honor to be moderating this panel. I've got 4 very esteemed guests that will be sharing their thoughts on issues that we've really uncovered since the pandemic has hit us. We all knew that there was a patient safety crisis as well as a healthcare worker safety crisis, but the pandemic has really exposed us to many of those issues moving forward. So I wanted to thank you for making it happen. Let me start, with Helen. Helen, we've been friends for a long time, and you've been an international patient safety leader for the past 20 years. I would love to hear your experience and share them with everybody who joined us today on how this pandemic has affected progress made in the patient safety arena, say, over the past 10 years. Are we better off today, or are we set back, in your opinion?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Rajiv. I'm very happy to be here. I think we all know that the pandemic has really been a bombshell in the healthcare system. It's, in terms of patient safety, it's just laid bare the cracks of the things, the system, the things that we've been crying about in the wilderness for decades. Infection controls at the top of the list, I think, training, really careful, diligent research into the different aspects of medical safety of medical care and drugs and devices. I think in the U.S., it has really exposed the folly of trying to treat healthcare as a for-profit enterprise, especially in terms of staffing and preparation. And it's shown healthcare workers, and I hope they'll heed the lesson, that these concerns affect their health, well-being, and job security as much as their patients. It's raised questions about overuse, misuse, and misdirected resources that we haven't yet really even begun to explore. And it's given us a worst case scenario of what the hollowing out of our public health apparatus can lead to. So above all, it's exposed disparities in care, especially among the different population groups, and what I would really call the cruelty of our care home systems in every Western country. I think the lesson's got to be that healthcare has to be treated as a mission, not a business, and that basic safety and preparation measures have got to be required, not just encouraged. So I'll stop there, David. I mean, that's a very high-level response, and I'm happy to go more specific.
Helen, no, that's wonderful, and I appreciate your thoughts. We've shared, you and I, conversations about the issue, and I always appreciate your ideas because you see things so uniquely, having been involved for the last 20 years. I'll turn to Tracy now, and Tracy, I'd like to start with the second question that we talked about that we thought would have merit for this program. The pandemic has exposed many other weaknesses that we've known in the healthcare systems, that dealing with socioeconomic determinants of care, access to care, populations having worse outcomes than others. You spent a lot of your career devoted to this issue, and your LitMag, Please See Me, deals directly with these issues well before the pandemic. So could you share with everyone here today what your perspectives are on how are we going to fix this? How are we going to get better moving forward?
That's a great question and a big question, Dave. And I think I'm going to answer it within my area of expertise, which is stories and narratives. And, for a long time, we've been working to tell stories that really elevated the conversation around patient harm, to make physicians better, to make patients more engaged. And we've done that with our portfolio of films like the Lewis Blackman story and the Michael Skolnick story. And over the last 10 years, I realized that there were large portions of the population that weren't able to tell their stories or didn't have a place to tell their stories. But those vulnerable populations, especially, those stories needed to be shared. So 3 years ago, after I completed an MFA, I was around a lot of people who were doing some really creative things with stories and narratives, and decided that a LitMag would be a good place for our populations, specifically vulnerable populations within healthcare, to be heard, and providers as well, who are caring for those patients. So the mission of Please See Me is to elevate the stories and the voices of the elderly, people who are suffering from mental illness, people of color, all those different populations that traditionally aren't heard in the traditional medical journals and the medical narrative and medical humanities places that had been growing. And boy, if you build it, they will come. We now are in our 5th issue, and we had a writing contest in our 4th issue to raise awareness around issues surrounding mental health. And we had 1,000 submissions, over 1,000 submissions for that issue. And it really showed me that we are in the right place, and we're only just beginning. So I'm excited for our 5th issue to come out that really is looking at heroes, and in this time of COVID and the pandemic, pointing out that these vulnerable populations have really suffered far more than I think people realized. Even though we knew that there were gaps in our care, this really elevated that knowledge. And we've got a whole section on COVID stories alone that are really showing the different disparities, socioeconomic issues in our different care places. So pleaseseeme.com is where to go to learn more. But this is just the beginning, I think, of something that has been needed for a long time. And hopefully other people will look at this model and find ways to elevate these same stories as well. But I'll pause now and we can come back to it if you like. Happy to talk more about it. It is a passion, you're right.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. The LitMag Please See Me is just the stories and poems and narratives from patients as well as caregivers really moves me and so many others. So great work on that front, and keep it up.
Thanks, Dave.
Sure. I'd love to move to you now and start also with the second question, since we started off with issues related to the pandemic. You've done a lot of research and you recently published a wonderful paper that talked about what can we learn from other industries in coming out of this pandemic. In particular, how do we return to elective and non-urgent type procedures and surgeries? How do we get people back for their biopsies and endoscopies that they're afraid to come back? And I think you used aviation as one example of learning. Could you share your thoughts with our audience about how we should do this correctly? And I'd be curious to get your thoughts if we are doing it correctly, or are we too urgent right now and moving too quickly?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much for the opportunity as well. And hello everyone from the UK. We've published about 10 papers in the last 3 or 4 months, actually, about human factors related to COVID, and so in a sense been busier than ever. I think the main thing for surgeons is not operating. So I've got a lot of my colleagues who are not operating. They've been stopped and things. So they're really anxious about getting back to work. So in aviation, we talk about currency. So if you're current to fly, and if you're not current to fly, you're not allowed to fly. And of course, for surgery, for endoscopists, for interventional cardiologists, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're not doing your procedures, you're going to become stale. And I suppose the further you move away from it, you're less likely to be expert. And it's not just your technical skills, I think, I need to stress that, it's your non-technical skills as well. So your thinking process, your decision making can be influenced. So learning from aviation, they've done lots and things, as you know, and time obviously doesn't allow me to talk about those, but we have just published a paper looking at currency, basically, and looking about how to ensure that you're safe during the pandemic. And if I could just summarize just a couple of points from that. Really, your currency is your expertise, your experience. So someone like myself, if I've done 300 salivary gland or parotid operations, I should be more expert, if that's the word, than perhaps a very junior trainee. You then have the risk of error on the other side, and your workload is like the meter reading, if you like. So as your workload goes up, if you have a more complex case, for example, you're much more likely to go into that error zone, and particularly if you're not as experienced, if you haven't got that wealth of expertise. So that's a freely available paper. I think it'll be published in the next week or so. So please look that up on PubMed. In fact, all of the COVID papers, as I'm sure you know, are free and easy access, and that includes all of ours as well. Thanks very much, David.
No, thanks, Peter. Like I said, great work. I just, yesterday looked at the amount of publications you have put out since the beginning of this pandemic, and you are truly a machine.
It's been busy, yeah. It's been very busy, but I'm really lucky to work with some fantastic airline pilots, with National Air Traffic, with some amazing collaborators. So I see myself as a bit like a conductor of an orchestra, really. It's not me writing into the small hours all the time.
Well, they've been very informative and timely and much needed, so thanks. Raj, great to see you. Raj and I have been friends for many years and still work together at MedStar and many projects. It's great to have you on the panel. You're right there in the front of human factors also. You've had an amazing career, but over the last couple of years, you've really changed your focus to the electronic health record and have produced some amazing research and publications showing some positive, but all the safety issues that have been uncovered since we've rolled out EHRs. I'd love to get your thoughts on just where we are with our electronic health record, and in particular, anything that the pandemic has hit and affected us even more during these very stressful times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dave, thanks for having me here, and great to join Peter, Tracy, and Helen, just some incredible expertise here. So, I'm sure as many people have experienced as they've used the electronic health record and other health information technology, there are clear benefits to it. There's no doubt about that. And when you in fact talk to most clinicians and ask them whether they would want to go back to paper or continue using the electronic health record, overwhelmingly they say use the electronic health record. But there are also lots of challenges with the technology. And these have been talked about for quite some time pre-COVID. Big challenges around interoperability. So can we actually have the information that we need connected between different healthcare facilities, even between different providers within the same healthcare facility? And a big area of focus for our team has really been around usability and safety. So how does the design, the implementation, and the maintenance of the technology actually impact the kinds of errors that were made? So I'll sort of spend my time just talking about two key things. The first, pre-COVID, I'll talk about some of the major usability and safety challenges that we saw, and then I'll touch upon some of the things that have been exposed because of COVID. So pre-COVID, what we saw was really that these usability issues are impacting patient safety in two ways. First, they're indirectly impacting patient safety because the design of the technology contributes to clinician burnout. And we've seen a tremendous amount of literature on when there's a burned out clinician, the clinician is more likely to make an error impacting patients. So there's that area of focus. And then the second is the direct consequence of poorly designed EHRs and other health IT, where we see certain kinds of errors that increase in likelihood or new types of errors that happen because of the technology. And I'll give you a couple quick examples of that, and unfortunately some really horrific cases. One is if you think about the usability concept of display of information. So you always want to have an information display, the screen to be decluttered. We want our clinicians to be able to find the information that they need immediately, and it should meet the way our clinicians do their work. It should support the way they do their work. But what we've seen in many displays is that oftentimes that's not the case. So in one example, we looked at two major EHR vendor companies, and we looked at how many medications do they display when a physician attempts to order Tylenol. And what we saw is that there are 86 different results that are displayed for Tylenol. And in this particular instance, the case we were looking at was ordering for a 21-year-old male. And of those 86 options are infant Tylenol, children's Tylenol, and a whole host of other irrelevant medications. Now, Tylenol typically is not considered a high-risk medication. It's simply an example. You can imagine how much of a burden that puts on our physician every time the physician wants to order Tylenol, to look through 86 options. And it's too easy to select the wrong one. And oftentimes that slips through the cracks and actually reaches the patient. Another horrific case like this is when we look at a patient in New York, a young boy that was out playing basketball, scratched his knee, started not feeling well that night. His parents took him to the emergency department, and they ran the labs. And the display of information of the labs in the emergency department for a CBC, a complete blood count, left out the BANS value, a key value that would help in the diagnosis of that patient. And the display didn't show that that value was missing. And so the physician scanned the results, all were normal with that BANS value missing, discharged the patient, and the boy later died of sepsis. And that's just a horrific incident where pure design display of information could have at least eliminated that contributing factor to the issue. So we really need to take a step back and think about how are we using this technology? How can we optimize it? We certainly don't want it to go away, but we have to spend time optimizing it. And I'll just briefly touch upon what we've seen with COVID. So with COVID, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in several other countries, as COVID started to emerge in the United States, we attempted to put in all kinds of different rules baked into the electronic health record to help with decision-making around screening. So we'd have some basic screeners of, did the patient travel? Where did they travel to? What are the other symptoms that they have? And the amazing thing about electronic health records is we can standardize that now. So we can roll that out to all of our different hospitals and outpatient clinics, and we can start screening every single patient that comes in. The challenge is that there's no good standard way of doing that. And so some healthcare systems were able to do it very quickly while others couldn't. And maintaining that over time as our knowledge changed and we had to change those rules became a very, very big burden. So the infrastructure is only partially there. And the other major issue we see is the connectivity of information. So as a patient goes to one clinic and then to a different clinic, as their care transpires over time, there's no connectivity or interoperability. And so we end up with gaps in terms of what we know about the patient and the care that they received, and we end up with an incredibly inefficient system. So I'll stop there with those highlights, but happy to continue on later.
No, thanks, Raj. And yeah, the case you alluded to was the Rory Stoughton case, and that was heartbreaking for all of us. And his parents have just devoted their careers now trying to make a difference and raise sepsis awareness across the world. So yeah, great topic. I could talk to you about that topic for hours moving forward. But since we did jump into human factors, and Peter, you're right up that alley also. You're a very well-known expert in human factors. Give us a basic, what is human factors from a sort of like human factors 101 standpoint for those in the audience that may not have heard the term used as often as we do in the safety field? And then some great examples maybe that you could share of things we do every day that would qualify as a human error mistake. I count them now, and I make about 15 to 20 a day. I was amazed myself. But share with us a little bit your perspective on what is human factors and some common errors that we make.
No, thank you very much again, David. And I loved your talk, Raj. Actually, it was superb. And firstly, I think I need to say that I'm not a human factors expert. There are ergonomics experts out there that are true human factors experts. I'm a surgeon with an interest, if you like. So I'm just an enthusiast and kind of learnt along the way, I guess. I think the clue to human factors is in the name. You can ask 100 people and get 100 different explanations about what human factors is. But for me, it's actually very simple. As humans, we live in a complex world, complex technology, complex interactions. And as you said, David, in that environment, we are liable to make mistakes. And as you said, you make 15 mistakes a day. That's higher than average. The average is about 5 to 7 a day, to be honest. So you ought to look at that. But for me, human factors is literally about those factors that influence how we behave, our physiology, our performance, how we interact with others, members of the team, how we interact with systems and healthcare, and I suppose technology as well. So, of course, the great experts are the airline pilots interacting with the technology, and that's where ergonomics comes in. So, again, we could spend hours and hours talking about human factors, but I think it's actually very, very simple. And my PhD is 272 pages. I got it last year, and it actually starts off by saying that human factors is extremely simple, and it's basically common sense application. So for me, we leave common sense at the front door when we come to work. And let me just give you just a few examples of that. How many of us go to work and don't have breakfast in the morning? That might be habit or what have you. But if you don't have breakfast, you are not physiologically correct. So you're burning ketones. And if you look at numerous studies, particularly from the States, of school children, they perform less well than school children that have had breakfast. So that would be something that I would recommend. And then lunchtime, how many of us work through lunch, or we have a long 6-7 hour operation to do, or a 6-hour ward round to do, and we just don't stop for lunch? And recently I was talking to cardiologists, and they have a 6-hour ward round and they go non-stop. And I said to them, why don't you just stop halfway through, just have a 10 or 15 minute break for lunch, have something to drink, and you feel so much better. And they came back to me and said, oh, Peter, you're a genius. It's like, I'm not, this is just common sense. And so talking about drinking, if you lose 1 to 3 kilograms of your body weight through perspiration, dehydration, and of course with the COVID situation at the moment, wearing the full PPE and things and the mask and things, it's very difficult, and you will lose a lot of perspiration. So if you lose 1 to 3 kilograms, your cognitive function falls by 20%, which is absolutely staggering, isn't it? Really. So it's and of course it happens very, very slowly. So you don't actually realise that your cognitive function is suffering. So how many of us go home at the end of the day with a headache because we haven't drunk the 2 litres of fluid that we're supposed to? Common sense. Just a couple of others then. Tiredness, again, is another great factor, I think. So if you're on call, if you're doing busy operating things, and I would always recommend, if you are operating, stopping every 3 hours or so and taking a 50-minute break. And we've published on that and found that you actually catch up the time and your performance improves. But if you're awake for 18 hours without any sleep, your performance is the same as if you're 2 times over the UK alcohol limit. I guess that's going to be similar. I don't know what the limit is in the States, but it's going to be very similar. So, we need to take our rest and things. And finally, if you're angry, and a lot of us, particularly when we're stressed, we get into a situation where we get really tense and things, and it's very easy to shout out or shout at others and things. That you're 30 times more likely to make a mistake if you're angry. So there's a useful mnemonic to remember, and that's me finishing now. It's HALT, H-A-L-T. And what does that stand for? Obviously that means stop. HALT means stop, but HALT stands for if you're hungry, if you're angry, if you're late or lonely, or if you're tired, just stop. Step back from what you're doing, take a few minutes to rest and to reconsider. And even if you're operating, there's very few instances, unless you've got a massive hemorrhage or an airway issue, when you can't stop just for a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes, just to step back and think about things. That's all I've got time to say, I think, David, but thanks again.
No, thank you, Peter. And maybe sometimes I confuse my errors each day with sometimes senior moments and forget things more often. But there's a great talk on the 3 different types of errors that we make. And a great example, and I'm always reminded of his talk, is I probably do it 3 or 4 times a year, is every night I get up, I set the coffee pot, I put water in it, I put coffee in it. And so when I wake up in the morning, I just hit the on button, and I go and, come back out and my coffee's made. There's at least 3 times a year where I've got clear water because I forgot to put the coffee into the filter. I do it every day over and over again, yet something that night distracted me. And
it's usually distraction, isn't it? Which is the thing. And there's this great thing about multitasking, and people say I can do this and things. And the answer is we can't. We're not built to multitask. And you're a great example of that, David, I think.
I am, and it's just, and you
we all are.
You do it once and you say it's an error, and okay. But when I did it the second time, like a few months later, it was like, come on, haven't you got this down?
But it's common sense. It's common sense.
It's common sense, but we do it every day, and it happens every day, unfortunately, at the front lines of care, and it's good people that are just being human. So, Raj, I want to go back to you since we're still on the human factors before I go back to Helen and Tracy. The EHR companies are huge companies. I've spent time in my career dealing with some of them. You've been battling them for, ages. Tell people some of the things you're doing behind the scenes, because sometimes large tech companies just don't want to change as quickly as we need them to change. So, you're doing some amazing work. Could you share it with everybody? Because it really is outstanding.
Well, thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. It certainly is grueling, and so I'll take any compliments when I can get them. First I'll just take a step back and say we focus on these large electronic health record vendor companies, tech companies all the time. We do need to recognize that there are several issues that come to play with the technology. And so there certainly are design issues and things that stem from those companies, but there's also decisions that we're making as healthcare facilities about how we train our staff, implementation decisions about how the technology looks, et cetera. So, we always describe this as there's shared responsibility. Everybody needs to be contributing here. But certainly vendors and those companies are a big part of this. So if we take a step back and we look at least in the United States, how some of this unfolded, it was the 2009 High-Tech Act that put $40 billion into the US economy that really helped these companies grow. And that $40 billion went to hospitals and other healthcare facilities that were adopting products, but we have to recognize that that was basically a pass-through, right? Because the healthcare facilities and hospitals were then paying for those products. So overnight, there was this massive shift to everybody wanting to buy EHRs, and really two big companies kind of came out of that, Epic and Cerner. And there are different corporate cultures there. There are really big challenges with helping them see the safety side of this. So much of our work for the last 5 or 6 years has been, part number one is to demonstrate the impact of poor design usability on patients. We put a short research letter in JAMA several years ago showing that direct impact. We then figured, gosh, we need to really push Congress on this, so let's show it with children. And I always feel funny saying that, but sometimes the only way to move Congress in the US is by showing that children are impacted. So we partnered with the Pew Charitable Trust and 2 other major children's hospitals, and we showed, sure enough, these systems, the design of these systems is having a significant impact on children and injuring and killing children. We're still not getting the policy moves that we need to. So we've testified in front of Congress on these issues, in front of the US Senate. We've been working with several senators and members of the House to try and move legislation. Very recently, we got one big win, and this is when I say we, I mean the broader community here, which is in the United States, again, many of the contracts between healthcare facilities and EHR vendors has what's called a gag clause, which means you can't actually share pictures and screenshots and videos of these safety issues that are critically important that we highlight, which means if you have a patient that's injured at a hospital in Virginia and a hospital in California is potentially having the same issue, you can't actually share a picture, screenshot, or video demonstrating the issue. So there's no transparency on these safety issues. Very recently, that was within the last few months was pulled back. So now we're going to begin to open up some of the conversation. But the key actions we have to take as a community is that's just the start of this. We now need to make sure that we get a central database where we can collect all of these and make sure that people are reporting on these issues, whether it's a near miss all the way to those that are causing harm. And by the way, it's not just in the US. These products are in Australia, they're in the UK, they're in many other parts of the world. And many of the design of these systems is very, very similar. And so you could even imagine having a global database of these events. So step one is we need to get all of these issues reported and into a central database. Step two, and this is where we often miss with reporting systems, is we actually have to do deep analysis of these reports and roll out those findings very, very quickly so we can make changes. And we've been trying to work with the federal government to try and get that reporting system. We haven't had any luck there at all. And so I think that's where we have to really think about, maybe it's a public-private partnership to get this done, or trying to work with some vendors and other stakeholders to create something where we can get these critical issues reported. And I'll come back to that case with Roy Staunton. That issue is still not fixed. And in fact, most people don't even know that issue exists in the very systems that they're using, not only in the United States, but in several other countries. That just can't happen. And so we have to do everything we can as key stakeholders in patient safety to make sure that this information is communicated.
Raj, keep leading us in the right direction, and maybe one day we'll get them to listen. But great work. I'm going to go to Helen before finishing with Tracy. Helen, you and Rosemary Gibson and others taught me very early in my career the importance of the patient and family voice and everything we do around quality and safety. And we made that a big mission at MedStar, and making sure that everything we did, we made sure that we checked with patients and families on were we doing it correctly. Our Candor program, we would have gone way off the tracks and done it wrong if we hadn't brought you and others to the table to help us design that program. Where are we today, Helen, in your mind, with bringing the patient and family voice into the conversation, into boards, and helping us make quality and safety better?
I think we've made a huge amount of progress. When I look at it, there's so much that we didn't have when I started in this 20 years ago. So we've got patient voice and governance. We've got patient engagement councils, patients involved in design. We've got a lot more transparency. We've got more ethical treatment of patient harm, as you mentioned. And we've got, systematic processes, evidence-based medicine that patients know about. Patients did not even have access to the literature. I mean, this was all a black box and sort of a closely held secret 20 years ago. So we've made a lot of progress. And to me, the most important part of everything that we've done in patient safety is really patient engagement, the patient and family voice, because it's the one thing that has the power to turn medicine on its head. Don Berwick said something like, if you center on the patient, everything else will follow. And we have not always centered on the patient. I think one of the things that happened in COVID, which was really sort of an existential crisis for me, was that patient engagement and, to a varying extent, patient safety were just shunted aside as though there were luxuries that really nobody had time for if they were getting down to the serious business of medicine. And I think that was a terrible mistake. I think it accounts for a lot of the harm that we have seen, that there was nobody there to care for these patients in a lot of cases in care homes and in some hospital wards, and nobody there to sort of watchdog what was going on. So I think it's an opportunity for us. I don't think that will happen again. Patient groups were stunned at the rapidity with which that happens, but they're beginning to organize now, and I don't think it will happen again. And I think, just lastly, as Raj was saying, technology holds so much of the answer, and part of what we really have to look at is big data, and big data from the patient perspective. The patient's the end user. There's often a huge difference between what patients think is the outcome and what their physicians think is the outcome. And it is the patient's voice that matters. That should be obvious, but it isn't always obvious. So we need to get the patient-reported outcomes to serve as a counterbalance to data that we're getting from other places. And that data really is available. It's coming into being in the private sector generally. That presents its own set of issues, but I think it's going to really be the salvation.
Thanks, Helen. I always love your perspectives as somebody working with the WHO, IHI. You work with so many organizations to make sure the patient voice and family voice is incorporated in whatever comes forward. Tracy, finish us off. Stories and narratives. I've learned through my career that I can bore the heck out of anybody with PowerPoint slides. But the best thing is a story or a narrative that grabs the heart, the emotion, that people remember. Tell us a little bit about the work you've done through your career and stuff that you, me, and Helen have done together with the group.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. I think you and the people talk. Stories connect the heart with the head, and we've been saying that for over 10 years. It really, began with the Tears to Transparency series that I mentioned earlier. It was Black story and my story. You can write the book. We decided to do a film that told those stories, really to improve care so that patients and providers could both connect on a deeper level, but also be more aware of the experience of the other. And I think that's one thing that's worth really well is that you can't live everyone's experience, but you can gain empathy by hearing stories of people who aren't like you, of patients' experiences providers haven't had, or patients understand where providers are coming from sometimes. And our short film was one of those short narrative films portfolio across the years, as you mentioned. that can be found because they're there that's out of our recognized quality and safety. But that short film was really intended to, connect patients and providers on the level that people first, they see me as a person before you see the other patient and provider. So, stories, they connect the heart and the head, but they also reveal for change. And that really came up in this discussion too. You mentioned that, tech companies are, reluctant to change. It's so important right now that safety be embedded in the technology that's coming, whether it's EHR or telehealth. And I think stories and narratives, as you mentioned, pitch in a way that David has. It puts a face to all the data. And while our portfolio has grown over the years to elevate capabilities in various areas of healthcare, to move initiatives forward, be it sepsis or just culture, I think it's become
absolutely.
far more
it's because Helen's mic's not on mute.
Have the power to change the way people think without kind of like sneaking.
Thanks very much for that, Tracy. I think the line isn't as clear for some reason.
And they can try and refute it, but if you hit them in the heart, they're gonna think differently because you're gonna move them. You're gonna also help people feel empathy. That has a different effect than data.
I think the line isn't as clear, unfortunately, on the connection.
And this COVID pandemic has really showed us that we have a lot of work to do. And the stories that are going to come out of the pandemic, I think, are really going to be the things that.
Okay.
Thanks, Tracy.
The line is a bit unclear there, Tracy, but we'll be sure to redirect everyone to the amazing work that you've been doing, and especially around capturing those narratives. We'll be sharing those handles on the page. I'll just pass over to David for some closing comments on what's been an excellent session to round off the summit.
I just want to thank everybody. A great panel, Peter, Ellen, Raj, Tracy, great thoughts. I hope this was valuable to everybody. I learned a fair amount and just listening to everybody today. Finally, I just wanted to, on a little bit of a selfish note, let people know, as Rajiv asked me to, I am now doing a virtual walk across America to raise awareness about healthcare safety. I just got out of the shower, my hair's all wet. The group of us did 12.5 miles in Denver here, and going to do another 12.5 and looking to raise awareness in the Denver community. But over the last 4.5 months, I've walked over 900 miles, which gets me about a little over a third across the United States, and I'm going to continue to draw attention. You can follow me at the hashtag on Instagram and Twitter at Walk for PT Safety. So that's Walk for PT Safety. Every day I walk in memory of a patient or a caregiver who's lost their life due to preventable harm. We now have over 400 people around the world who are walking during these days from Great Britain, Mexico, Australia. So please follow all of us, and together we can raise more awareness about the safety crisis.